April 1915. A calm Thursday afternoon along the Western Front. Canadian and French soldiers rested in their trenches near the Belgian town of Ypres, some writing letters home, others smoking cigarettes, all waiting for the next artillery barrage to begin. The war had already ground to a bloody stalemate. Both sides had dug themselves deep into the earth, trading the same few hundred meters of muddy ground back and forth for months. Nobody expected what was coming. Nobody could have possibly prepared for it. At 5 in the evening, German soldiers quietly opened 6,000 metal cylinders, stretched along a 4-mile section of their front line. A strange yellowish-green cloud began rising from the German positions. At first, Allied soldiers assumed it was smoke, perhaps some new kind of screen meant to cover an infantry advance. They watched it drift toward them with curious fascination. The cloud moved slowly, hugging the ground, rolling forward like something alive. It seemed almost beautiful against the fading afternoon light. Then the screaming began. The cloud was chlorine gas, 168 tons of it, and it struck the French and Algerian positions first. Within seconds, men who had survived months of artillery shells and machine gun fire found themselves choking, burning, dying in ways they could not comprehend. Their eyes swelled shut, their throats closed. They clawed at their own faces, as if trying to tear away something invisible. Some ran blindly. Some collapsed where they stood. Some simply stopped moving forever. This was the moment warfare changed permanently. A weapon had arrived that no training prepared you for. No courage could overcome. No trench could shield you from. It crept into every hole, every dugout, every shelter that soldiers had constructed to stay alive. In those first horrifying minutes, there existed no defense against it whatsoever. Yet somehow, men survived. Not because of technology or equipment. They survived because human beings, when pushed to the absolute edge of existence, become capable of extraordinary adaptation. This is the story of how soldiers facing an invisible killer learned to fight back with nothing but instinct, creativity, and materials so primitive they would have seemed ridiculous just hours earlier. The nature of trench warfare made gas attacks especially deadly. For months, soldiers had learned to dig deep, stay low, and construct elaborate underground networks for shelter from constant explosive bombardment. These survival habits worked perfectly against conventional weapons. Against gas, these same habits became fatal traps. Chlorine gas is denser than air, nearly 2.5 times heavier than the atmosphere humans breathe. When released, it does not rise and scatter like smoke. It sinks downward, flows like water, follows every contour of the landscape, and pools in every low point available. Trenches were the lowest points on any battlefield. The very structures built to protect soldiers became perfect containers for collecting poison. Men who had spent months learning to duck below the parapet now discovered that ducking meant breathing more concentrated gas. Those who fled into their dugouts found that the deepest shelters filled with the thickest poison. Every survival instinct that kept soldiers alive against bullets and explosives now led them directly into greater danger. Everything they understood about staying alive was suddenly completely wrong. The physical effects of chlorine gas begin within seconds of exposure. The chemical reacts instantly, with moisture on contact, and the human body contains abundant moisture. Eyes, nose, throat, and lungs all become burning points of agony almost immediately. The gas combines with water in the respiratory system to form hydrochloric acid. Soldiers were not merely being suffocated, they were being chemically burned from inside their own bodies, their own moisture activating the weapon against them. Men described the sensation as drowning while standing on dry land. Their lungs filled with fluid as tissue broke down, and they experienced the terror of suffocation while still technically able to draw breath. Many who survived initial exposure died hours or days later, drowning in the fluid their damaged lungs continued producing. The psychological impact equaled the physical horror. Soldiers could handle visible danger. They could see shells coming, hear machine guns firing, understand threats they faced. Gas arrived silently, invisibly, killing without any comprehensible mechanism. Men watched friends die screaming, clutching their throats, faces turning blue, without understanding why. The enemy might be miles away. There was nobody to fight, nobody to shoot at, no way to strike back. This helplessness shattered men who had withstood everything else war could deliver. Units that had held positions under the heaviest bombardments simply dissolved and fled when the yellow cloud appeared. The first instinct of most soldiers was covering their faces with whatever cloth was available. They wrapped shirts around their mouths, pressed handkerchiefs over their noses, buried their faces in scarves and rags. This accomplished almost nothing. Chlorine gas passes through dry fabric with minimal resistance. Gaps around any improvised mask let contaminated air through easily. Men who believed they had protected themselves continued breathing the poison, their false sense of security preventing more effective action. Many soldiers also attempted to outrun the gas, climbing from trenches and sprinting toward the rear. This sometimes worked if wind was slow and men were fast. More often, physical exertion forced deeper breathing, drawing more poison into lungs with every desperate stride. The young and athletic sometimes died faster than those too exhausted to run. What changed everything was water. Not special water, not purified water, but any water at all. Soldiers noticed that men pressing wet cloth to their faces seemed to survive better than those using dry coverings. The reason was simple chemistry, though nobody understood it during those first chaotic hours. Chlorine gas dissolves readily in water. When poison passes through wet fabric, a significant portion dissolves into moisture rather than continuing into lungs. Wet cloth acts as a chemical trap, capturing gas before it inflicts maximum damage. But water alone proved insufficient. The amount of chlorine that could dissolve in a small wet cloth was limited. Once fabric became saturated, it stopped providing protection. Soldiers needed something that would not just absorb chlorine, but neutralize it. Something that would chemically react with the poison and render it harmless. The solution came from an unlikely source, from the basic necessities of trench existence, from substances so crude and undignified that military planners would never have considered them defensive equipment. Urine. The word spread through trenches like a secret password. Urinate on your cloth. Press it over your face. Breathe through it. The instructions seemed insane, degrading, impossible to follow. But men who obeyed lived, and men who refused died, and that brutal equation convinced even the most reluctant soldiers. Within hours of the first attack, thousands of men along the Western Front were pressing urine-soaked rags to their faces and surviving encounters that should have been fatal. The chemistry behind this improvised defense was remarkably sound. Urine contains ammonia and urea, both alkaline substances. Chlorine gas is acidic. When acid meets base, they neutralize each other, producing compounds far less harmful than either original substance. Ammonia in urine reacted with chlorine to form ammonium chloride, a relatively harmless salt. Instead of reaching lungs as corrosive acid, the poison converted into something the body could tolerate. Wet fabric still trapped chlorine physically, while the chemical content of urine neutralized much of what was captured. It was imperfect protection, but it represented the difference between survival and death. The effectiveness of this method varied enormously based on uncontrollable factors. Wind speed and direction determined gas concentration when it reached trenches. Temperature affected dispersal rates. The amount and freshness of urine mattered. The tightness of seal around the face made crucial differences. Two soldiers standing side by side using identical methods might experience completely different outcomes based on dozens of invisible variables. But overall, the technique worked well enough that it spread through Allied armies within days. What makes this moment remarkable is not survival alone, but what it reveals about human adaptation under extreme pressure. Military planners had spent decades developing weapons. Scientists had worked years perfecting poison gases. Entire industries had been mobilized to produce and deploy chemical weapons. Yet the defense that emerged was not developed in any laboratory or approved by any committee. It came from men on the ground, from their desperation, their experimentation, their willingness to try anything that might keep them alive another hour. Within weeks, crude respirators began appearing at the front. First versions were little more than cloth bags with chemical treatments applied, essentially the same principle as urine-soaked rags in more standardized form. These were soaked in sodium thiosulfate solutions or other compounds that neutralized chlorine more effectively. Later versions added multiple layers, better seals, and eventually the activated charcoal filters that would become standard in gas mask design. But every development traced its lineage back to those first moments when men without equipment solved an unsolvable problem. The improvised solutions revealed something important about gas weapons themselves. In the first attack at Ypres, Germans achieved complete surprise and created a gap several miles wide in Allied lines. They could have won a decisive victory. Instead, they failed to exploit their advantage, and the gap closed before breakthrough could occur. Subsequent attacks using identical methods achieved far less. Once soldiers knew what to expect, once even the most primitive defenses were available, psychological shock diminished and physical damage could be partially mitigated. This pattern repeated throughout the war. New gases were developed, each more lethal than the last. Phosgene arrived in 1915, more toxic and harder to detect. Mustard gas appeared in 1917, burning skin as well as lungs, persisting in the environment for days. Each new agent created fresh crises, new casualties, new waves of terror. And each time, soldiers adapted. They learned to recognize subtle signs of different gases. They developed decontamination techniques. They built better masks, better shelters, better warning systems. The lessons of these chemical battles extended far beyond the trenches. Modern gas masks used by soldiers and civilians descend directly from those first improvised protections. Understanding that chemical threats can be neutralized, as well as filtered-shaped defensive equipment designed for generations. Emergency protocols for chemical incidents still emphasize principles soldiers discovered through desperate trial and error. Cover your face. Seek higher ground. Move upwind if possible. Use wet cloth as a last resort. Perhaps the deepest lesson concerns the relationship between humans and technologies designed to destroy them. Throughout history, new weapons have emerged that seem to change everything, that appeared to give possessors irresistible power. And throughout history, human beings have found ways to adapt, resist, and survive. Not through superior technology initially, but through creativity, observation, and absolute refusal to accept death without fighting back. The soldiers who survived those first gas attacks had no laboratories or research budgets. They had their own bodies, their own minds, and whatever materials they could find within reach. They figured out in hours what specialists might have taken months to develop under controlled conditions. They accomplished this while dying, while watching friends die, while facing a weapon that violated every understanding of how war should work. When the cloud finally cleared and survivors counted their dead, they had already begun changing the equation. They had proven that human adaptability was itself a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. The men who invented chemical warfare believed they had created something unstoppable. They had underestimated the one factor no weapon can fully account for: the extraordinary capacity of human beings to refuse the fate others design for them. Today, those yellow-green clouds are gone from battlefields. International treaties ban their use. Modern armies possess protective equipment that would have seemed miraculous to soldiers of 1915. But somewhere in every gas mask, every chemical defense protocol, every emergency response plan, echoes of those first terrible hours and the incredible improvisation that followed remain. Survival is not always about having proper tools. Sometimes it is about being the right kind of human. the kind who looks at an impossible situation and refuses to accept that it is truly impossible. Technology did not win in those trenches. Adaptation did. That lesson remains worth remembering, not just for warfare, but for every impossible challenge awaiting us in the future.